All right, so I just finished my round four game, and it was a really long fight, and I'm kind of hungry now. So, as usual, I'm going to try and keep this brief, but it was also just a really interesting game. I'll probably have a lot to talk about, a lot of lines to discuss. So, I was playing a player by the name of Shubh Laddha, who's actually from the US, but I haven't heard his name before. And he's one of three players from the US playing this tournament, the other two being myself and Ray Robson. So, yeah, he's a younger player, maybe 14 or 15 years old, and he's gained hundreds of elo within the last year or two. So I knew it was not going to be an easy game. And I decided to go for a Taimanov Sicilian, which is one of my main openings as black. I've been playing a lot of different Sicilians these days between Accelerated Dragon, the Dragendorf. The previous round, round two, I played the classical Sicilian, had a fun opening there. But here I played Taimanov, which is a line I've been playing for many, many years, probably since I was rated around like 2100, 2200. And I decided to play this because I saw he had one game in this line Queen F3, at least one game I could find. And this is a line that has been really trendy in recent years among like top level grandmasters. And it's an attempt to refute the Taimanov completely. And I actually stopped playing the Taimanov for a while, partly because of this line. The point of Queen F3 is to get a pretty double-edged position after queenside castle, eventually queen g3. There's some lines actually where the queens get traded, and it's a nice positional play for white, especially if h pawn takes and the h file opens. So I did a lot of preparation before the game, and I was very much ready to meet queen f3 with knight to f6. And next few moves follow prep, 95, queen g3, b5, and f4. So it's already getting pretty sharp. Knight's attacked, played knight g4. This is still prep. And here there's a few moves for white, the main move being bishop g1, which is what he played. There's actually a small trap here, is that if white plays e5 too early, then I don't actually have to move the knight. I can take on e3, and after queen e3, there's b4. And this is already considered to be better for black. I see there's a bunch of games on Lichess, but if we see Masters Database, black scores really well here. I think I'll go ahead and hide notation just to avoid any potential spoilers. But yeah, bishop g1 was played. I play h5. I should note that after bishop g1, white is threatening e5, removing my knight from defending the other knight, so h5 adds extra support. He plays e5 anyway, and I use a similar idea to counterattack the knight on c3. And this is a very important move because if I don't have b4, then what am I doing with this knight on f6? So here white has an option. He played the move that I was expecting, knight a4. I think this is also possible, but maybe black is already doing well here just because the queen side's opening up, and the black king is actually very safe. So he plays knight a4, and I centralize my knight. And here he plays bishop d3. So bishop d3 was the first move slightly out of my preparation. The main line I had prepared like an hour before the game was h3, knight h6, and f5. Assuming I'm remembering this correctly. And this is a really, really crazy line, which I don't think I'll have too much time to delve into the details, but I was prepared maybe 5 or 10 moves more beyond this. Not sure if I would have remembered my preparation during the game, but we didn't go quite into this. And before the game, I also looked at bishop d3 in this position, after which g6 can be played. So when he played bishop d3 in the game, I pretty quickly played g6. Just very similar idea. And this is a useful move because it discourages pawn f5, and it secures f5 square for the potential knight maneuver. But on top of this, I realized during the game, there's cars honking outside the window. I don't know if people can hear that, but what was I saying? Oh yeah, I realized during the game that there's actually a cool trick here, is if white plays h3 here, I don't actually have to play knight h6. I can play bishop h6, threatening to take on f4, but also pinning the f-pawn, so I'm threatening to take on e5. And I think this is already like very, very good for black. So after I played g6, he took kind of the first long think of the game. Yeah, he spent almost 20 minutes, we can see by the timestamps, to play king b1. And I think this is the best move. Now, I'm not going to analyze with the engine just yet, and I haven't analyzed with the engine at all. Just got back from, or just finished the game like 20 minutes ago, so I'll save engine analysis for later. But yeah, king b1 just getting off this diagonal, and now if I play bishop h6, he can probably just play a move to defend the pawn. So I decided to develop bishop e7. He kicks the knight, I move back, and bishop e4. Rook c8, so natural improving moves, and at queen f3, creating the battery. Also enabling the g-pawn to move. In certain cases, white would like to play g4. So I play knight to f5. And there's a tricky line here. I set up a small trap that if white does play g4, I can take, trade rooks, and then play knight g3 with a pretty nasty fork. And after queen moves somewhere, I take, and knight c3 with a discovered quadruple fork. And this would be really nice. So, of course, he didn't go into that, but it was nice to fantasize about the funny lines. Instead, he plays bishop f2, which is a much more solid move, connecting the rooks, also restricting my knight. So, yeah, here the position is very, very tense. A lot of tension between the knights, between the bishops on the diagonal. I have the battery on the c-file, but the pawn's defended by knight and bishop. This knight's a bit loose. So there are a lot of things going on here, and yeah, it was a difficult position to kind of process what exactly is going on. But I decided to play queen a5 here after a very long think. Spent 21 minutes on this move, and there were so many like just crazy lines I was calculating, which I'm super curious to check with the engine, but I'm gonna resist for another few moments. The point of queen a5 is simply to attack the knight on a4, and the first line I calculated was b3, but I think this is losing for white after knight c3. And of course, I'm hitting the king and hitting the bishop, so after takes, even though my bishop would be hanging, I have this mating idea. So if we got to this position, I don't think white has a good defense, just because, yeah, how does white stop the plan of queen a3, queen b2? And if bishop e3 is played, then I can just take it and then still play this, and queen c1 doesn't work because I can take, and then win the bishop in the end. So he didn't play b3. And he played a move I actually wasn't expecting. When I played queen a5, I spent most of my time calculating a really crazy knight b6, which at first looks impossible because the knight is attacked twice. But if I take with the knight, then bishop takes b7, and if I take with the queen, I'm aligning with the bishop on f2, and white can take here. So, yeah, if knight b6 were played, I was actually thinking about playing a really insane move, rook c3. Oops, not mouse slip, but rook c3. Yeah, just a crazy line hitting the queen, leaving the rook attacked, but if takes, I would take and then win the bishop, and the knight will hang eventually. I might also be just having a mating attack. So, yeah, if rook c3, I was looking at rook to d3, and I spent so much time on queen a5 because I couldn't quite come to a definite conclusion about this line. Like, I was calculating further here. I was actually looking at a funny line, takes, and b3. I don't think this works, but it would be really funny because so much stuff is happening. So I'll probably analyze this later with the engine. I'll also leave a link to the game in the video description in case people want to analyze all the funny lines on their own. But let's get back to the game because he went for a completely different direction. He took on f5, which I kind of dismissed when I played queen a5, because after he takes back, I'm hitting the bishop and hitting the knight. And it turns out that white has to sacrifice material here after takes. The only way to keep the game somewhat close is to take on d5 with a rook. So I completely missed this idea when I played queen a5, but I think overall I was happy to see this because we get to an endgame after takes. I'm up the exchange, and white does win back the pawn after knight b6, rook c6, knight takes e5. But once I had time to evaluate the position, I was pretty sure that black is really the only one playing for a win. Even though it's imbalanced, and yeah, white has knight and pawn for rook, but there's a lot of things going in black's favor, given I have the half-open g-file, half-open c-file. Even though my pawns look a bit weak, they're actually hard for white to exploit, because I have a5 coming. If ever knight e3, I have bishop c5, which is a very useful resource. And yeah, there's not too many like potential forks around the king, especially after my next move, bishop e7, just kind of restricting any knight f6 move, and potentially wanting to go to d8 to completely restrict the knight. So I was feeling pretty good at this point, still had some time advantage, but of course it's very much a fight. He plays h4, which I think is a reasonable move, preventing me from playing h4. I play rook g8, hitting the g-pawn, g3, and now rook to g6. So decided not to castle this game, but rather to rook lift, and figured this was the only logical way to activate the rook. And now there's some ideas of maybe rook c4 and rook c6 to double up. And then also another idea with rook to g6 is to maybe play f6 or d6 eventually. Try and disturb white's nice pawn on e5. And eventually that is what happened after rook d1, a5, rook e1, rook e6, b3. I finally get in this move, pawn f6. And it looks a little bit weird because I put my rook on a square where it doesn't have any moves. And if somehow the knight could attack it, the rook would be trapped, but there's no good way for the knight to attack it. These moves just are not possible. So yeah, after f6, my opponent played bishop d4, and at first I thought I was in very good shape, but the more I thought about the position, the more I realized it's still very, very tricky, because white has enough defenders on e5, and the move I initially wanted to play here was d6, which just leads to very funny setup with the rooks and pawns aligned on the 6th rank. The point, of course, is to attack the pawn multiple times and exploit the fact the pawn is pinned. But I didn't end up going for this move because I wasn't sure how to evaluate bishop b6, threatening knight c7, and I was calculating some funny lines here, but I couldn't quite make them work. Like, I wanted to go for this, takes, give back the exchange, and then after takes, there's an idea to trap the bishop after takes and then rook a6. But I wasn't sure about this because white has rook d1, and if I play like king c8, there's rook to d5. And wherever the king moves, the bishop's going to have a square. Like king c6, there's bishop d8, and if, yeah, king here, there's bishop c7. So it's possible d6 was a good move, but I decided to go for a different approach, and I took on e5 and played bishop c5. And it took me a while to even consider this, but I think it's just a simpler option, going for some simplification. He plays bishop b2, and now I have the move bishop f2, and this leads to a bunch of trades of pawns, because I am guaranteed to win the g-pawn, but white wins my f-pawn, and then the h-pawns come off the board. And because I'm playing for a win, it is a little bit risky trading a lot of pawns, because if white can just keep trading pawns, and it just becomes much more difficult to win when you're up the exchange. So I did want to keep at least a few pawns on the board, and I was fortunate here to have the move rook h6 to basically defend the bishop through x-ray vision and offering the trade of rooks. And here I was expecting my opponent to go for the rook trade, after which I'm not sure how easy this would be to win. Like it's probably closer to a draw than a win for black, because there's eventual a3 or c3 and more pawns are being traded. But my opponent played rook f5, and I think this is a practical mistake because I'm able to keep both rooks on the board, and the rooks are able to work together very nicely, especially to team up against the c-pawn, as we'll see. So I took a think here. Originally, I wanted to play bishop e1 to threaten this or this, but then white has rook f1. I was calculating some bishop c3, but then I considered a different move, bishop to d8. And once I saw this, I realized this is actually a really nice work for the bishop. It holds together the a-pawn, restricts the knight, and plans the same rook h1 or rook h2, and white can only stop one move. So my opponent played rook f1, I get my rook to the second rank, and as we see by the time situation, we're both getting low on time, but my opponent's a bit lower in time. He plays knight to e3, defending c2, and here I realized that it's still not so simple because the move I want to play is bishop g5, but then he has knight c4, and it just cuts off my rook from attacking the pawn, and the knight's really solid here. So I found a tricky move to play, pawn a4, trying to deflect the pawn away from covering c4. And I was expecting my opponent to play this anyway, after which I would play a3, and maybe there's still chances to win this. But to my surprise, my opponent took the pawn, and then this just allowed non-stop initiative for me after bishop g5. The knight no longer has the c4 square, has to move, and then I win the c2 pawn, hitting the bishop. And here we see white's position crumbling after rook a2. I win the a4 pawn, and yeah, it's very, very close to mate. Like all I need to do is get my rook to the b file, but I can't play rook b4 just yet. So I start with rook to a5, hitting the knight, threatening rook to b5. He plays knight c7. I play king d8, and then he plays bishops to c3. So as we see, white's pieces are in a bit of disarray. Knight's hanging, king's a target, rook's not being too useful here, and I'm still cutting the king off as well. So here I play rook to c5. Now both minor pieces are hanging. And he had one last trick here, played bishop to b4. And I have to be sure not to cash in too quickly, because if I take the knight, I would be up a rook in this position, but I would also be getting mated in one move. So I saw that and instead play rook back to c2. And here I'm not getting mated because of rook f8, which is what he played. I just take the knight, and it's me who's threatening the forced mate with eventual rook b2, rook a2, and then the other rook to b2. We played on a few more moves, bishop d6. I have to be careful not to play king c6 because that would lead to a draw. But yeah, king b7, rook c3, and he resigned in this position. So yeah, a very, very hard-fought game. A lot of different stages in this game, between just opening preparation, the really tense middle game, the possibility of a lot of crazy tactics, and then the endgame struggle as well. So I feel relieved to come away with a win. I think this game could have easily been a draw if maybe my opponent played a bit more precisely in the endgame. But yeah, can't complain. I am currently 2 out of 4, beating the low-rated players who I played and losing to a couple of very strong grandmasters. So tomorrow is round 5. It'll start at 5 p.m. Abu Dhabi time. If you want to watch live, I will leave a link to the broadcast in the video description. And yeah, thanks again. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys in the next video.